from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, the one place, LBC, where on a Sunday morning, rather than watching and listening to all the other programmes where it's journalists talking about journalists, you get your chance to have your say. Now, it's the 24th of June. The sun is shining, just as it was 2 years ago when we woke, well, I hadn't actually gone to bed, but when we woke up to find out this dramatic result had happened and the country, despite all the warnings, had voted for Brexit. 2 years on, many people who voted Brexit think we have not got anything like the progress we wanted. And it would appear that some, maybe quite a lot, of those who voted Remain are still really unhappy with the result. So I'm going to ask you this morning, would a second referendum be a good thing for the country? And then at 11 o'clock, as Trump receives massive criticism, initially for the separation of children from their parents when families were illegally trying to get into America, we compare the way the Americans deal with illegal immigration to how the European Union deals with illegal immigration, and there's an emergency summit taking place in Brussels today. And you know, within a couple of weeks, Angela Merkel could be gone as leader of Germany. So immigration in many ways dominating global politics at the moment. And I'm going to ask you, whose policy is better, Trump's or the European Union's? But yesterday, about 100,000 people were in central London protesting, demanding that we have a second referendum. And one of the leading lights, of course, in this whole movement has been Gina Miller, and here she was yesterday.
It's time we took this back to the streets and the lanes, the towns and the villages, the meadows and the squares of this country. It is time for you to decide, for you to take back control. It is simply dishonest for them in that house to say that they still believe the will of the people is the same as it was 2 years ago. Together, we must stand up, demand our voices are heard, demand a people's vote, so that future generations can hear us say, we did our bit, we stood up and shouted for a country that's together, kinder, tolerant. This is not a time to be silent. Let me hear you shout for a people's vote now. People's vote!
Well, Gina Miller there, she wants a second referendum. Remember, she did her bit. She went to the Supreme Court to try and get Parliament to have a meaningful vote. And I guess the most prominent politician that was there yesterday, and by the way, no sign of Jeremy Corbyn. A lot of those people there yesterday wanted to see Jeremy Corbyn, but of course the truth is, he can't say it too loudly in public, but actually Jeremy's been a Brexiteer all his life. But the one big party leader that was there yesterday was Sir Vince Cable from the Liberal Democrats.
We've had our warnings yesterday about what could well happen in the future. You've had some of the most important companies in the country. Yesterday I was in Wales. The Welsh economy depends to a significant extent on Airbus. It's given a warning that if the current impasse in the negotiations continue, if we get no deal or if we get a bad deal with frictionless borders, all those things that Nigel Evans has described to you will not happen. We're already getting a slowdown in investment. It's very clear in the car industry and construction and much else, and the future will not be bright if we continue along the present path. The divisions in the government, the mess they're making of negotiation, and we've got thousands of people here demonstrating, want to stop Brexit, want to have a people's vote on the final deal.
Stop Brexit. He couldn't be clearer, could he? Now, there were also yesterday in central London about 5,000 people marching in favour of Brexit. And don't think on this second anniversary that all the Brexiteers have gone silent. Here's Liam Fox.
We need to be pragmatic about how we actually achieve our exit. The other is to remind our European partners that we're not kidding, that we would walk away rather than accept a bad deal for Britain. I sincerely hope we get a good deal, and I think that's in the interests of the European Union as much as the United Kingdom.
So there's huge lobbying going on both sides here, and Theresa May going to Brussels this Thursday for a summit. This summit was supposed to be dominated by Brexit, but I think Mrs Merkel's problems and the massive row going on about migration may well push Brexit down the agenda. Now, another party that was there yesterday was the Green Party, and joining me this morning is the co-leader, Jonathan Bartley. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning, Nigel. Thanks for having me on.
No, not one bit. Now, Jonathan, I have to make a confession to you that in 1989, in the European elections, I was a paid-up member of the Tory party, but I looked at the Green manifesto, and it said that the European community, as it was then known, was bad for national democracy and gave us an economy that was dominated by giant multinationals and big banks. And you know what, Jonathan? I voted Green. I was very happy to vote Green. It's quite a journey your party's been on, isn't it?
It is quite a journey, but I noticed you the other day even were suggesting that you might back a people's poll. And I think you
No, Jonathan, I don't... Look, we had a referendum in 1975, right? In 1980, opinion polls showed a majority wanted to leave the EEC, but we had to wait 41 years for another referendum. Do you really think it's credible, just 2 years after the biggest exercise in national democracy in this country, that we have another vote?
Well, it's something that you were flagging just back in January yourself that you think was a credible option. You were certainly
I was warning people that it may happen. I don't want another. I mean, there's no need for another referendum. After all, everybody said that our decision would be final.
One thing I think we can both agree on, Nigel, is that these negotiations have been handled dreadfully. And
absolutely. Listen, I'm absolutely, completely with you on that, all right.
The referendum didn't settle the question, and it's clear from opinion polls, you mentioned opinion polls, it's now 2-1 in favour of having this people's poll. I think we both also agree that democracy should be an ongoing process. It's not a one-off thing where winner takes all. We know that the referendum divided the country, and that's the nature of a winner-takes-all debate, a winner-takes-all move, which has split the country down the middle. Now, we need an ongoing discussion. We can't just discard 48% of the country, and nor can we just ignore what the government is negotiating and the fact that it doesn't match up to what a lot of us voted for on both sides.
But actually, now, Jonathan,
what are you afraid of? Nigel, just what are you afraid of?
What I'm afraid of is, I think, a second referendum would be even more divisive for this country. And actually, when we talk about uncertainty, most people in business just want to know, what are the cards in my hand that I have to play with? And I think that to do this again would lead to greater uncertainty. It also, I mean, Jonathan, what would happen, Jonathan, if, let's say, in a second referendum, and actually, given that 70% of the country now just want the government to get on with it, I suspect if there was one, that the Leave side would win by a bigger margin for lots of reasons. But I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. Let's say that your side won 51-49. What should we do then? Have another referendum in 2 years?
So I think the key thing is not to have a kind of another winner-takes-all vote. It's the process.
Well, either we leave or we don't.
But there are very, very different ways of leaving and very, very different ways of staying. And, going back to your original point that you opened up with, I didn't answer properly. I do think the EU needs reform. Absolutely, I do. And we need that conversation. And rather than having these two sides yelling at each other, and this is what my co-leader, Caroline Lucas, the point that she made in her speech at their rally, which I think was probably the best speech there yesterday. She's saying we need to re-engage with those people to understand what was behind the vote 2 years ago and understand where people are now.
So you want us to reverse our vote, Jonathan?
We have all been shut out of this conversation for the last 2 years. We've been forced to yell from the sidelines. The government has not involved us in what should have been a people's process. The referendum should have been the start of a process of engagement, of understanding where people are at. I've been to Leave areas, I've been to Remain areas, and I hear the same thing from those places. The people feel neglected. They are really angry. They feel sidelined by an elite, and I think we both agree on that as well.
Is it possible, Jonathan,
for the future of the country?
Is it possible, Jonathan, that actually Italy might leave before us? I mean, isn't the whole European project literally falling to pieces in front of our eyes?
I'm not the person to make predictions about the future of the European Union as a whole. I think anyone in this current climate where things are changing so rapidly would be very brave to make accurate predictions. But what I will say is I incredibly value what the membership of the European Union has brought to this country. I really value the EU nationals who treat my son regularly at hospital, who's a wheelchair user and depends on the NHS. I value the freedom that I had to move throughout Europe and continue to have at this time, and I want for my children. And I'm listening to my children right now who are very, very concerned about the direction that this country is taking, the path that we're set on, and are really frightened for their future. And that fear comes from a growing xenophobia, a vision of Britain that wants us to look inwards.
So the Leave vote was xenophobic, was it?
No, I'm saying that the whole direction that this country has taken is very much turning in on itself rather than looking outwards, trying to build walls rather than bridges. And if we are going to tackle the challenges that we face in the 21st century, we're going to have to build those bridges. We're going to have to work with partners. And I'm very, very worried that the direction we're taking ourselves in is shutting us off and shutting us down. I'm
tempted to say we have been building walls on the bridges in London to protect our security, and that's one of the reasons people did vote Leave. Jonathan, the big day, whatever kind of Brexit it may or may not be, the big day is the 29th of March next year. If we do leave the European treaties we've left, do you right now believe that we will or will not leave the European Union at 11 p.m. on March the 29th next year?
I'm not going to make predictions. I tell you what I want, and that is I want the people to be involved in the process. I want a people's poll. And personally, I will go on campaigning as long as I possibly can to stop the Brexit process, because I believed before the referendum that it was the wrong decision. My views haven't changed. I still believe it's the wrong decision, and I will always fight to my dying day for the things that I believe in, the principles that I hold dear.
And there's nothing wrong with that in a democratic process, and I understand that fully. Jonathan Bartley, co-leader of the Green Party, thank you for joining me. Well, you've heard the argument for a second referendum. Would it be good for the country? I think it would be even more divisive than the last poll that we had. I think it would lead to greater business uncertainty, and it'd have been absolute kick in the teeth for the entire democratic process. We were promised whatever we decided was final, and now the established political classes want to reverse Brexit. It simply isn't good enough in my view. Let me know what you think. Call 0345 60 60 973. You can text to 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Facebook Live and comment there too. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 16 minutes past 10. So on the second anniversary of Brexit, 100,000 people march in the streets to demand a second referendum. Some say it's on the final deal, although I think Vince Cable perhaps had more clarity than the others. He simply wants to stop Brexit. And all of this, of course, against the backdrop of the Airbus announcement. Now, Airbus saying if there is no deal, they would seriously consider what their future would be in manufacturing in the United Kingdom, because they want us to be part of the customs union / single market. My thoughts on that. Airbus is an intensely political company. It was set up that way. It has been subsidised by billions and billions and billions of euros of taxpayers' money. And where their argument falls to pieces is aerospace internationally under World Trade Organization rules is a no-tariff regime. So Airbus, it makes no difference to you whether we're in or out of the customs union or single market. And Airbus, most of your engines are made in the United States of America, which of course is not part of the European Union and doesn't have a deal. And when you threaten us and say that if you close down in this country, you might move to China, well, China, I don't think, is part of the European Union either. This is business scaremongering. We saw it, and being done in a very political way. We saw it 20 years ago with the euro. We were told by big firms, told by many in the city, if we don't join the euro, Britain will fall to pieces. Well, we didn't listen to them then, and we shouldn't now. But let's get back to the march, and let's get back to the motivation. And I want to really understand why people think a second referendum would be good for this country, because we really do not hear this argument enough. And I'm going to go straight to Phil in Cobham in Surrey. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Nigel. Well, I mean, I went on that march specifically because I'm representing a new party, Renew. You know, you've heard about it.
Yeah, more than that, you've been on the show, Phil. So, you know, I like to give all sides absolutely the opportunity to put their point of view.
Absolutely. I mean, Nigel, you admitted yourself that back in 1989, just on this programme earlier, that you considered joining the Greens.
I voted Green. I voted Green because, Phil, I voted Green because they said that the European community was bad for democracy, and I agreed with them, and they also said that it played into the hands of the giant multinationals, and I agreed with it then, and I agree with that argument now.
Well, for sure. But the bottom line is that the world has changed enormously since then. That's why the Greens have changed their position. They see that the future lies in international cooperation, as exemplified, in my opinion, in the form of the EU. But I mean, bottom line is they changed their opinion because of how the world has changed, primarily driven, in my opinion, by the internet revolution.
And money, Phil, may have something to do with it, in that European political party funding, etc. I might just throw that in as a suggestion.
Well, but you throw that into everything. I mean,
what is true?
Regarding the Airbus issue and stuff like that. Of course, there are always lobbying factors here. I mean, that's the world. That's the modern world we live in, and that's just the point.
Phil, I accept that. I accept that. But you tell me why. Tell me why, Phil. Please just tell me why a second referendum would be good for this country.
But for starters, because of the huge ramifications of a decision that was given to people largely, and I don't mean this disparagingly at all, because it's totally understandable, but most people were totally ignorant of the true facts. But this is true, Nigel, whether you like it or
people.
Not. It's not stupid. It's not. Most people, look, as you say, if I've got an ailment, Nigel, I don't deal with it myself. I go to an expert. This is the whole point. This is why we actually do have, and we can vilify experts, but ultimately you have to trust people who know more about the subject than you do.
Yes. I've heard that. I mean, that's the European Commission's argument. Why?
Well, it's a totally justified argument. I don't see how you can say yes, Nigel. I could say to you, how many people know how the European Union operates? Who's in charge of the institutions? I could go on the street now. I could come over to LBC headquarters. We could do it right now, and most people wouldn't have a damn clue.
Well, maybe not on technical detail, Phil, but the actual referendum itself, if you think about it, it couldn't have been simpler, could it? Do we wish to be a self-governing nation, for good or bad? Or are we better off being part of a big political union called the EU? That is what the referendum was about. Simple as.
Absolutely. It's so simple as, and with huge ramifications.
Of course.
The world has moved on. We face an unbelievable challenge coming from the East, and we have no idea how that is going to play out.
Well, the world has moved on, Phil, since the referendum, because now, I don't know whether you noticed, but in Sweden this week, the Swedish Democrats took a 7-point lead in the opinion polls on a manifesto of giving Sweden a vote on whether they should stay or leave the European Union. We've seen a political revolution in Italy, and we've now got the growth of the AfD in Germany threatening Merkel's position. I mean, Phil, Phil, this is big change.
Do not understand what the European Union ideal is all about.
So all Europeans are stupid?
That is the problem.
So it isn't just the Brits that are stupid, all Europeans are stupid?
You're always going to have a section of people who will challenge the status quo for whatever reason. Maybe their own gain. Maybe these are business people who see maybe a little angle for their own gain. There's always you can always point to some person's specific reason for doing something. Okay. And maybe some of them are straight on racist. I don't know.
The bottom line is stupid, racist. We're hearing it all here, aren't we, really? You're very disparaging. You're very disparaging about Leave voters, Phil.
I'm just proposing it as a possible, alternative explanation to just, the fact that suddenly people think the EU is this evil monster, which they don't largely understand, and they don't understand the ideals of it. We could all do one thing, just look up the original preamble to the reasons for the creation of the original, European EEC, as it was then, and just read what that is, about. It's a very, enlightening and ennobling. It's only a few paragraphs long. It would help people to understand Phil,
I know, I've been 20 years in Brussels, and I know a lot of the old-timers, people who've served their entire careers in the European Commission, have said to me, we came here in the 70s, we came here in the 80s, we believed in the project, we believed in post-war reconciliation between France and Germany, and nobody in their right minds, Phil, back in the 50s could have opposed that idea. The trouble is, it's morphed into something very different, and that's the argument I get even from inside. Phil, let me just ask you a quick comment on something. I've seen the pictures of the people that were in the crowds yesterday. it looked incredibly white and middle class.
It was incredibly white and relatively, I would say, middle class.
Yes.
But there were, there were plenty of blacks there. As I said, predominantly, yes, for sure. But I mean, ultimately, you still got to balance that against the demographics of our country, which is predominantly, white and arguably middle class.
Oh, I wouldn't agree with that. Phil, listen, I've given you a good showing. I'm going to move on. I've got lots of other people want to come on. Robert on Facebook says, why wouldn't leavers want to pass up the opportunity of showing Remainers that even more people than ever want to leave the EU? Robert, I'm absolutely convinced, particularly given the way that Barnier and the others have behaved, it's put people's backs up. I'm convinced the second referendum would see a bigger result for leave. But why on earth should we have to go through it? We were promised it would be a final result. And all right, a second referendum in 20, 30 years' time might be reasonable, mind you. I'm not sure it'll even exist in 10 years' time. Richard says, we had a vote and we all knew what we voted for. The government sent out a comprehensive leaflet stating exactly what the vote meant. Stop trawling that silly excuse. It was quite clear. Let's go to Chris in Croydon. Good morning, Chris.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. Yes, the point I'd like to make is, in fact, these protesters yesterday shot themselves in the foot with their own argument when they said that democracy is an ongoing process. The EU is the reverse of that. It is ever-growing centralisation.
Yes.
So the logic of it is, OK, suppose we vote and vote to go back in. What happens in 5 years' time? We change our minds, as electorates do, as many of those people will do as they get older and wiser, I should hope. That's the whole thing. That's with being a noble ideal. That's the lack of accountability has turned the most noble ideals into tyrannies.
Yes.
Look at the Roman Catholic Church, for example.
Well, and one could argue, Chris, communism. You know, that in 1917, in Russia, there were very high ideals, and look at the monster that it became. Chris, your point's a good one, because what is interesting, they also, yes, of course we need some reform, Nigel, but Monsieur Macron and Mrs. Merkel, however long she lasts, I mean, they're currently proposing a Eurozone budget with a Eurozone finance minister with the power to intervene in nation-state economies. They're moving even further away from democracy, Chris, aren't they?
Yes, and another thing, what happens once we got safely back in? I mean, it's like a man who's just been let out of jail, hammering on the gates of Wormwood Scrubs after to be let in, isn't it? Suppose once we're safely back in, and old Merkel says, oh, by the way, here's your 200,000 sub-Saharan African refugees. That's your allocation.
Yeah, and of course, the rebate would disappear completely. I mean, any thought of saying that we wish to stay, we wish to rejoin, they would utterly and totally humiliate us. Chris, your point about democracy is a very powerful one. I thank you for it. Well, after the break, more of your calls. Would a second vote benefit this country? I don't believe it would. Let me know. 0345 6060 973. Plus, we'll talk a bit about the Turkish elections, which are taking place today and could see big change in Turkey. But for now, it's 10:30. Well, 100,000 people marched to say there should be a second referendum, that Brexit has got to be stopped, and we have a debate on that. And one of the representatives, Phil, of the Renew Party, makes some, I think, pretty disparaging comments about Leave voters. Nikki on Twitter has picked him up. Caller Phil is very generous. He says people that voted Leave may not have been thick, just racist. Well, there was a bit of an implication of that. But let me know, do you think a second referendum would be a good thing for this country? Meanwhile, in Turkey, and we don't talk a lot really in this country about Turkish politics, but there is a big presidential general election going on in Turkey today. President Erdogan, very much the strong man of Turkey and seen by many to have taken Turkey in a route that is pretty undemocratic, use of emergency powers, but for once he has a real challenger. And to help us find out a bit more about what this might mean, I'm going to go to Michael Daventry, the former editor of the London Turkish Gazette. Michael, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So we've got a challenger, I understand, to President Erdogan.
Well, we've got three, actually. We've got, in order of least popularity, there's a Kurdish candidate who is in prison. There's a woman who's broken off from the main nationalists. And then there is a man called Muharrem Ince, who's been nominated by the main opposition, CHP, the secular party. And he's run a campaign that's energetic and has been widely praised, actually, in Turkey. The question is, how well will he do?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
Well, I wasn't putting that to you as a question.
No,
we're not sure how well he will do. Part of it has got to do with the robustness of the Turkish electoral system, because there was a referendum in the country last year where they decided to move away from a parliamentary democracy and create an executive presidency system, and that gives sweeping powers to the president at the expense of Parliament. This is the first election that we have using those new powers. So if President Erdogan wins, he gets those powers. But if Muharrem Ince wins, then there's a chance, then he will get them.
Yeah.
But that everyone is expecting at the moment that it will be an Erdogan victory.
So the stakes are pretty high. And you mentioned the word secular. Of course, modern Turkey, founded by Ataturk, made famous by beating the British at Gallipoli. I mean, how far away from being a secular state has Erdogan taken Turkey?
Well, Turkey had a big problem with religion. Ataturk did a lot of wonderful things for Turkey, but one of the things a lot of his supporters and followers had done was to interpret this question of dividing mosque and state to extreme levels. So there was a stage 20 years ago where if you were a woman, a qualified doctor, you would not be allowed to work in a hospital because you were wearing a headscarf. If you took the headscarf off, that's fine. Suddenly you become a medical professional. But before that, you weren't allowed. So what President Erdogan's party has done in recent years, or previous years rather, was to change that. To basically say we shouldn't be afraid of religion. However, his popularity and the ineptitude of the opposition in the country has seen him take this very authoritarian strain.
Yeah, and I noticed over the last couple of weeks the Turkish currency having a very, very poor time, Turkish interest rates, Turkish bonds. I mean, there is a financial crisis with this too, isn't there?
Yes, there is. The dollar has shot up. The dollar almost reached $1 was worth about 5 lira at one stage, which is extremely high. And every Turkish person will follow the exchange rate because a lot of them will keep their savings in a foreign currency as they historically don't trust it.
Yes.
So there is an economic side to it, and the economy is definitely sluggish. But there are other aspects to this as well, and one of them is actually the European Union, because the European Union was, for Turkey back in the day, actually a very good thing. It was a source of inspiration and reform. It's because of EU-mandated reforms that Turkey did such things as abolishing the death penalty, or to do, boring but important policies like introducing housing ombudsmen and the like. But the EU has taken its eye off the ball of Turkey for a multitude of reasons, and that's contributed to the situation that Turkey is in today.
Fascinating. Michael Daventry, thank you. Well, we'll see what these elections bring, and Michael Daventry, former editor of the London Turkish Gazette, saying that Erdogan is still the favourite, but there is a big challenger. Maybe he can form some sort of coalition with the Kurdish. We'll have to see. But whatever, Turkey, definitely a country that is in some real trouble at the moment. Some breaking news. German police say 25 people have been injured, 4 severely, after an explosion destroyed a building in the western city of Wuppertal. We'll find out more about that over the course of the next hour or two. So back to the people's vote that Gina Miller wants, and some not all that impressed with Gina Miller. Who does Gina Miller think she is? One thing is that she's a troublemaker. She's a stirrer. We had a Democratic vote, and the votes that won were to leave the European Union. Les in Lewisham representing, a very frustrated point of view of some of the leavers. Philip in Whiteleaf says, if those of us who voted to leave were too stupid to understand what we voted for, then what would be the point of a people's vote, as we wouldn't understand what the deal was? Let's go to Martin in Dartford. Good morning, Martin.
Good morning, Nigel. Pleasure to speak to you. Before I go to the main point that I rang in for, going back to Phil's comments earlier, Brexiteers must be racist.
Yes.
I am a staunch Brexiteer.
Yes.
My partner's Italian, and she's also vehemently in favour of leaving. Mm-hmm. My sister-in-law is Indian, and one of my 7 staff is Lithuanian, so I think he's talking rubbish.
Yeah, it's... I have to say, it's just part, though, Martin. It's part, Martin, of this narrative that was just sort of people who vote Leave aren't quite bright enough. People who are cleverer than us and morally better than us should make these decisions. Martin, what's your main point?
Right. Unlike you, I think we should have a second vote, but the criteria should be different. We're leaving. That's it. We've made that decision 2 years ago. We should have a vote on whether we accept the government's pathetic attempts at negotiation or whether we leave without a deal. Because once we sign on the dotted line, we're stuck with that awful deal for decades.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, Martin. I understand what you're saying, but it seems to me that the real moment that matters here above... And by the way, Martin, I share all of your frustration. But it seems to me what really matters is 11 p.m. on March the 29th next year. Because if we break with those European treaties, we are once again a sovereign country. We are once again able to do what we like, and that would include, at general elections, fundamentally changing, through our decision, any deal that Mrs May has done.
Right.
That's my view. I mean, I could be,
I think if anyone tried to change that, we'd be back to where we are now with people like Gina Miller arguing the point that we can't.
But the other, the 100,000 people yesterday, they are saying, let's have a vote on the final deal, but of course what they're saying is, you're saying a vote to accept the final deal or leave without one. They're saying, of course, that it's a vote to accept basically, a chance to reject the deal, and if we reject the deal, we stay members of the European Union. So that's what they're arguing for, Martin. Martin, I understand what you're saying. I don't think there's much demand for it from other Eurosceptics.
Maybe not, but my fear is if there is a second vote now, because people are so disillusioned with the government's deal, they might think, maybe we should stay. Yeah. And if we did, as I think it was Chris before the news alluded to, the EU would cane us.
Oh, yeah, we'd be...
People talk about keeping the status quo. There wouldn't be a status quo.
No, absolutely, I agree with that totally. Martin, I thank you very much indeed for your call. No second referendum. What's the matter with these Remainers? They are just selfish people, in my opinion. They have no interest for the good of the country at all. If they did, they would accept the democratic vote. Well, that at least is the view of Kathy. I have to say, that clearly we need to recognise that there is some passion on the other side of the argument. There are those in this country who profoundly believe that the European Union is the right way forward for this country. But they are very much a minority. Now, coming up after the break, a great titan of British politics has intervened and threatens that he might bring down the Prime Minister. This is him speaking on the subject of Russia.
It is absolutely atrocious and outrageous what Russia did in Salisbury. We have responded to that. Frankly, Russia should go away, it should shut up.
I wonder if you can guess who that is. Gosh, doesn't he sound important? Doesn't he sound impressive? And he's threatening, perhaps, to bring down the Prime Minister. All will be revealed in a moment. For now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, and it's 10:45. On the 11th of July, there is going to be a NATO summit, and it will be a very dramatic NATO summit. Why? Because President Trump is saying we need other European countries to start spending more money. Why should we do all the heavy lifting? And this was a point was backed up by Woody Johnson, the American ambassador in London. Now, defence is a real issue. NATO has a real problem. There is, I believe, a challenge from the new emerging European, Army, Air Force and Navy. But also, against this sort of backdrop, Mrs May this week refused to commit to retaining Britain's status as a Tier 1 military power. You've heard this figure 2% that's been talked about for some time, and that is the basic membership fee for NATO. Only 5 countries out of the 28 members are currently paying it. But the feeling is that to maintain Tier 1 status, we need to be spending nearer 3% than 2%. Now, the voice that you heard before the break was Gavin Williamson. He is, of course, the Defence Secretary. He is wildly ambitious, quite why I'm not actually sure. And it's reported today in the Mail on Sunday that in a meeting with senior military leaders, he said to May, that 20 billion you're going to spend, we need it for defence. And the quote that is attributed to him is, I made her so I can break her. Gosh, it all sounds like a film, doesn't it? I mean, did you know that Gavin Williamson was the most important man in this country? Clearly, he seems to think that he is. I do sometimes think some of these people are promoted above their ability. That's my view. Perhaps I'm being unkind. I don't know. Right. Why would a second referendum be good for this country? Graham is calling from Hay on Wye. Good morning, Graham.
Hello, Nigel. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
I don't believe in a second referendum. I'm a staunch Brexiteer, but I'd like it to be put to this Remain campaign, which basically it's nothing more than a stunt to try and get us to stop leaving the European Union.
Yes.
They call it in couch terms like a Brexit rather than nasty hard Brexit. I wonder if what they would say if someone says to them, OK, you want a real people's vote, let's make it, OK, do you accept what will probably be a rubbish deal, or do you want to stay in the European Union, or for the disenfranchised people, millions of them, would you prefer to leave with a normal hard Brexit, no transition period, regaining control, saving ourselves £40 billion?
But we've already voted for that once, Graham, haven't we?
Exactly. But what would they say? Do you think they would say, OK, that will be fair, in the interest of democracy?
They would take their chances. They would take their chances, Graham. I mean, the only referendum I really want, Graham, is I'd love a referendum on whether we should maintain the House of Lords as it is. Now, that I would really thoroughly enjoy.
That would be interesting.
I mean, the House of Lords looks a bit like the European Union itself in many, many ways.
It's become part of the establishment.
Yeah.
What about the issue about democracy as well? There's stupid talk about, well, it's not a true democracy unless you're entitled to change your mind. How many times were we given the chance to change our mind over the last 40 years about Brexit?
41 years. 41 years, Graham. We had to wait.
It took a panicking Conservative government to get us a referendum.
Yes.
And I wonder how long it would be if we voted to remain, we'd get a chance to change our minds again.
Never.
Exactly.
Never.
I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Never. I mean, remember, Graham, over 400, I mean, this just shows you the gap in this country. Over 400 constituencies in this country voted Leave, and yet only 150 MPs represented the Leave side in the campaign. There is a chasm between the middle of the country and what's happening in London and Westminster. And my comment, Graham, which wasn't denied, is that when I looked at that crowd yesterday, they looked incredibly well-heeled, middle-class and overwhelmingly white. If I was to organise a protest march that was overwhelmingly white, I would be shouted down in the papers the next day for being against diversity. Slight double standards. Graham, thank you. Got to move on. John in Exeter. Good morning, John.
Hello, good morning, Nigel. Yes, I'm just calling to say it would be a terrible idea to have another referendum because the matter is already out of the control of the UK. Under the Article 50 process, and although there's been some UK lawyers saying, oh, you can revoke it unilaterally, the EU side has said, oh, no, you can't revoke it unilaterally. We can put conditions. And, you know, your colleague, Mr. Verhofstadt, has said, no, if Britain wants to stay, that's great, but, you know, we have to look again at all your opt-outs. You have to look again at your rebates.
The rebate's gone,
at this and that. Obviously, the rebate would go in, but the opt-outs as well, opt-outs from the Euro, opt-outs from Schengen, they would strip all of that out. They're not going to agree to an extension to the Article 50 timeline because there's the European elections coming up and there's going to be a big, struggle over who's going to be the European Commissioner, whether it's going to be someone...
What do you mean, John? They wouldn't want me standing in the next set of European elections?
Well, no.
Because that's what it would mean.
Next European. I think that there's going to be... Because you can see on the continent, there's this big power struggle on the right over the issue of immigration.
Yep.
With the CSU and the CDU
and the AFD
and the AFD and
what's happening, John? Actually,
Salvini
is the AFD are changing German politics and changing the whole debate in Germany, just as UKIP did in this country.
Yeah, and I think what will happen is that the whole Spitzenkandidaten process, you know, to do with the appointment, that there will be a big struggle between those factions, between kind of, you know, Mr. Kurz and Mr. Orban and the others on one side, and people like Mr. Macron and Mr. Verhofstadt on the other side, over who gets to be the head of the Commission and who gets to control the Parliament. And one side of that is going to want to make sure that all of the UK MEPs are out before the next European election.
Yes, although they're going to be in for a shock, John. I mean, with or without the United Kingdom, and I think it'll be without, I do think that the European elections in May next year are going to see a European Parliament very much more Eurosceptic than anything we've seen before. Do you know, when I first bowled up there in 1999, there were literally a handful of us. Out of 650 then, literally about 5 of us in the whole place who were Eurosceptics. Yeah. And I think after the next European election, it could be a lot bigger. John, I thank you. Yeah. Let's go to Kathy up in the Borders, Haywick in the Borders. Hi.
Hello.
Good morning. So, Kathy, would a second referendum be a good thing for our country?
Well, my view is that we should have a second referendum, but because I voted on the basis of 42 years living under the EU yoke, as I like to say to my Remainer husband, because I was brought up in Islington, I think the next referendum should take place in another 42 years.
Right. OK, that's pretty much the line I'm taking too. OK, so the answer is yes, Gina Miller, you can have your referendum. There's absolutely no problem at all. We were thinking about 2055 might be quite a good time to do it.
My only problem with this is that if we said, right, there's going to be another referendum, they would take hope and glory from it and constantly try to bring it forward. So you're sort of throwing them a bite, but that they would want to sort of make it, a bigger bite. So you'd have to deal with that, Nigel.
Yeah, no, fine, Kathy. I like your tongue-in-cheek answer to that question. Thank you very much. Let's go to Mark in Chertsey. Mark, hello.
Morning, Nigel.
Good morning. So, there's a lot of people arguing here that voters didn't understand what they were voting on, that the deal is going to be different to what people anticipated, and that democracy is a process that keeps on evolving.
I mean, it's ridiculous. We had a vote. We had a democratic vote. It went on for months and months. Both sides had their arguments, and we voted. We voted to leave. I mean, are we going to have a third, a fourth, a fifth? You know, are we going to play Skittles and see who wins that, and then maybe they can decide sort of which way it goes? Of course, we shouldn't have another referendum. I mean, these are the same people that have been banging on for 2 years. The Adonises, the Campbells, the Gina Millers. Yep. They just want to reverse Brexit. That's all they want. I don't know why they're trying to come out with this new people's vote. It won't be a people's vote. They just want to reverse Brexit.
Yeah, that's why I said, Mark, that Vince Cable was totally honest about it. You know, he wants an exit from Brexit. And the rest are dressing it up, aren't they, in all sorts of different ways. They even, Mark, say to us that they respect the result of the referendum. Really?
Of course they don't. They don't respect the referendum at all. And I was saying yesterday, I mean, if we don't leave next year, can you imagine the amount of people that will be coming out on the streets of London? People that voted leave. It won't be 100,000.
No, if you want to see a real protest, then I suggest Parliament what you do is make sure we don't leave on March the 29th next year, and then we'll show them how angry, genuinely angry people would be. Mark,
absolutely.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I'm just of the view, Mark, I think it's all been handled appallingly. There is a lack of vision from the Prime Minister, but I do think, given that the EU withdrawal bill is now off to get royal assent, it would be suicide for the Labour or Conservative parties to say we're going to stop the Article 50 process. Neither of them could win an election if they did that. And I still think, Mark, for those reasons, that we will leave on March the 29th next year, but have many years of tidying up to do afterwards.
I mean, I haven't been happy with the way we've negotiated our exit, but at the end of the day, it's still, I would say, better to keep the Conservatives in power because they still are saying that we're going to leave the European Union.
Yes, our Remainer voting Prime Minister is assuring us that Brexit means Brexit. It's not totally convincing, but hey, there we are. Mark, I thank you. I thank all of you. Right, well, now, coming up In the next hour, which member of Donald Trump's team has become the latest victim of a Liberal protest whilst out having dinner with her family? I'll give you my take on that because I've got some experience of things like that. We'll also look at the weather. It feels like a barbecue summer. Talks today could be the biggest pub takings in history. John Ketley will tell us what's coming up in the next few weeks and perhaps even longer. He may even predict the football result. Who knows? But first, Emmanuel Macron has called for EU countries which refuse to take in migrants to be fined. Another example of, frankly, Europe now beginning to tear itself apart. Meanwhile, in the US, Trump's tough stance has won the backing of many in the country. I want to know, who's right on immigration, Europe or Trump?